Welcome to this podcast series on pseudoscience, fake news, and how to fight back, supported by a grant from the Open Society Foundation and in partnership with the Challenging Pseudoscience Group at the Royal Institution of Great Britain. My name is Marius Turda. Together with my colleague Dr. Robert Pyra, we're inviting you to join a conversation about the meaning of history and the role of science in today's society. Our subject in this series is how history and science have become weaponized to support political agendas in East Central Europe, particularly during the last few years. This is intended as a lively and urgent contribution to the understanding of pseudoscience and of the uses and abuses of history in the era of the so-called fake news. My guest today is Ciprian Mihali, a philosopher, diplomat, and professor at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj, Transylvania. Ciprian will talk about the civic culture in Romania during the coronavirus pandemic. Ciprian, welcome.
Thank you very much, dear professor, dear friend. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today.
Thank you for accepting our invitation, Ciprian. Since March 2020, the coronavirus pandemic has spread rapidly across the world and with unprecedented impact. It has led to major changes to our everyday existence, affecting all aspects of individual and collective life, including the political culture. In some countries, such as China, Brazil, Turkey, Russia, or Hungary, we see how political tendencies, defined as authoritarian and illiberal, have been given a new lease of life by the coronavirus pandemic, allowing political leaders and governments to tighten their grip on our societies. My first question to you, Ciprian, is this. Has the political culture in Romania changed significantly since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic?
I think that the political balance in Romania has known some important modifications, some important changes since the outbreak of the pandemic last year. And I believe that the epidemic has rather accelerated certain trends which were already latent in Romanian society. And I would like to highlight here two of these trends which were then fully manifested during the December 2020 elections. I think the first one is the hostility of Romanian civil society towards the former left-wing power, represented by the Social Democratic Party, well known for its numerous corruption scandals and the incompetence of many political and administrative figures of this power. And this hostility has allowed the anti-corruption discourse to gain ground around a new party, the USR party, especially Union Save Romania, which created an alliance with another young party, Plus, the Party of Liberty, Unity and Solidarity. And an important part of the society, of the public, was attracted by discourse on anti-corruption. The second trend, which is more dangerous in somehow, is the official birth of the Romanian extreme right. I say official birth because maybe nationalist and xenophobic approaches or conspiracy approaches were already present in the public discourses of major Romanian political parties. For example, if you take the two major parties in Romania, the Social Democratic Party and the National Liberal Party, so-called the left party and the right party, but these parties have been able during the last years, during the maybe 10, 20 years, to mobilize such topics, such nationalistic or xenophobic topics, when they were in a crisis of legitimacy. Let us not, for example, to not forget that despite their so-called mutual opposition, the both parties embraced the referendum for the family in 2018. It was so-called also the referendum of shame, promoted by the Coalition for the Family, a neoconservative fundamentalist structure openly supported by the Orthodox Church and by the neo-Protestant churches. And finally, this referendum failed because of the low attendance at the ballot boxes. But the issues remained on the public agenda and were regularly taken up by the various political forces, by the traditionalistic forces especially. And the event, which was absolutely surprising for a lot of people in Romania, was that in 2020, a new party was born, assuming openly this nationalist, xenophobic, anti-European discourse, and with the pandemic, creating and promoting a conspiracy and anti-vaxxer discourses. To everyone's surprise, this party, called Alliance for the Union of Romanians, entered parliament with 10% of voters' preferences. And I think there are the two major tendencies in Romanian politics since the last years. You have 15% for the USR, the Union Save Romania, which is a right party, a young party with a strong anti-corruption discourse. And you have the extreme right party, which mobilize now a lot of frustration in the society, which had and still has a very strong and very aggressive public discourse.
Thank you. You explained very well the context that has been shaped by recent changes globally, internationally, and regionally, and how the pandemic affected the political culture of recent years in Romania. And I want to highlight something you pointed out, Ciprian, which I think is relevant to our conversation here, which is the rise of racism, xenophobia, chauvinistic behavior, anti-Roma attitudes, anti-vaccination. So you have quite a widespread campaign of misinformation and disinformation on the one hand. At the same time, you have, as you rightly pointed out, some domestic factors contributing to the emergence of some forms of political behavior, which was always present in the Romanian culture, which is, of course, nationalism and the idea that Romania needs to protect itself from the outside world and it's under siege. So you have this siege mentality in combination with a misinformation campaign, which is more or less international. Now, from your perspective, and I know you contribute directly and often to discussions in Romanian media about the quality of civic life, about honesty in journalism, about quality of academic performance, so big issues about corruptions. So you are a direct contributor to these debates. So from your point of view, how can you explain increase in forms of racism amongst educated elites, amongst people who should know better? And every now and then, and regrettably quite often, we see forms of racism and xenophobia coming not from the fringes, not from political parties such as the one you mentioned, but rather from intellectuals who are given a very wide platform in the public sphere and accordingly have a very powerful impact. So what's your opinion regarding this phenomenon, which is probably related to the pandemic? In some cases, as you pointed out, it goes back to the internal dynamic of the Romanian culture, Romanian politics.
Yeah, you're right. The pandemic, in my opinion, just accelerated some trends already existent in the society. On the other hand, pandemic came with a lot of fear, incertitudes, and a lot of problems for many persons, a lot of frustrations, health problems. And the pandemic shows a face of the society, a face of the state, the dysfunction of a lot of institutions, and the kind of distrust on state institution, government institutions. And so you have quite a critical approach, a critical discourse against the state, against the government. But it's not only critics. You know very well, we have to be critics against the government. But when these critics are canalized by the far right, by the extreme right, and combining the critique of governments with a lot of conspiracy, complotist theories, fabulations, and all kind of fake news, you address this kind of discourse to a public which is very fragile, very vulnerable. It's a lack of media culture, but also lack of education. The people are non-educated culturally and mediatically, if I can say like this. So people are very exposed to fake news. They lost the capacity to make distinctions, elementary distinctions, I will give you an example. I was yesterday in a rural region of Romania, you know very well, in the north of the country. I met a lot of people non-vaccinated, not vaccinated at all. They are not stupid people. They are simple people which were absolutely manipulated by this kind of discourse. 1 from 10 maybe is vaccinated, and in general because he or she has to do it in their job. But otherwise, people are completely out of the public discourse, completely out of the action of the government. So, in my opinion, this is, of course, in a wider perspective, it's because of this lack of culture, this lack of education, the scientific education, first of all. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later about the role of intellectuals or academics in this issue. But let's have this fact. People are not scientifically educated. So they are not able not only to understand the mechanism of pandemics, not only unable to understand how the virus spreads around the world, how it functions. Now there is no problem for me. I will drink a cup of scotch and I'll be okay. And there is no pandemic here. I didn't see anyone having the virus, etc. You have all kinds of brave discourses on the one hand. But on the other hand, we had here in Romania, since several years, but more and more strongly this last year, a very huge campaign of fake news and conspiracy theories. There are some TV channels which are promoting every single day this kind of discourses. It's a kind of, I don't know, you should have something similar in England, but at this point, having 3 or 4 from the major information channels, generalist channels, promoting everyday conspiracy theories, inviting every day for shows, for talk shows, the most representative of extreme right and the most sinister figures of anti-vaxxer campaign, at the end, you have this result. You have this mistrust, you have this fear, the social fears, and you have this complex of being under siege, as you say. It's exactly this. Under siege, everything is attacking us. Everything is dangerous for us, not only Black people, Jewish people, Hungarian people, gay people, but also virus. So the idea is to nourish fear, because people having fear are easily manipulated. And this is the secret of the rating, finally. There is absolutely no question about deontology, about preoccupation for the truth. There is absolutely no problem about this. The most important is shocking, extraordinary, tragically, etc., with the bombastic titles, with the bombastic images, and creating everyday scenarios and creating every day this kind of danger, imminent danger against all the population, which have to be united against such enemies. So there are direct causes of the rising of the extreme right, but there are also non-direct causes coming from the past, coming from different issues non-negotiated with the past. You know, assuming the heritage of communism, assuming the heritage of anti-Semitic politics, assuming the heritage of extreme right during the Second World War, etc. You know very well that all these problems were not negotiated and resolved. And periodically, they are coming back. It's the le retour du refoulé. They are coming back and they are in the top of the agenda, of the public agenda, as we have never discussed before about desperation. I see the same points, for example, very sensitive to very aware about racism issues in society. And every time you have a Black issue, it's exactly the same discourse as 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's a problem of learning. People are not learning anything about past experience, about past positions, past discourses or measures. We are in the same point. We are running very fast to remain in the same place.
You touch on so many important issues, Ciprian. Thank you very much indeed. And I want to underline a couple of items from your very rich agenda, namely the role of the media, as you pointed out. Comparing to other countries, well, the media works with the state, and you have an organized campaign of information and disinformation, and then you have the impact on that campaign on society. What you see in Romania, as you pointed out, you have the official line in the official narrative coming from the government or the state institutions, and you have media, namely some of the important TV stations, which put forward fake news and campaigns of disinformation. And you have the civil society or the society at large reacting. So you have three players rather than just two players. And that's very interesting. And that connects me to another issue which I wanted to reflect on briefly, which is the role of the civil society and the power of the state. Do you think that the success of anti-vaccination campaigns in Romania and the success of misinformation and disinformation overall is related to the fact that in certain areas, the state is weak or the state is unwilling to intervene? So you mentioned some of the topics such as racism, education, history, coming to terms with the past. But you also have other issues which are very present in society in Romania: housing, disadvantaged children, domestic abuse, minority rights, hospitals, very pressing issues and very real issues for the majority of the population. And do you see here a need for the civil society to be more active in those areas in which the state is weak?
Indeed. I think a kind of balance here between a weak state and a strong civil society. I saw the same thing, for example, when I was in Africa and Senegal, and it was quite similar, actually, with, of course, a state construction, which is not very strong, and you have beside many actors of the civil society. And I could say, indeed, that Romanian civil society is a very strong one and a very active one in different fields. And in this game, in this balance with the state, of course, its force comes also from the inefficiency and the inability of state institutions to respond to the most urgent problems of the population, and which are related, as you say, to the health system, first of all, but also social assistance, education, access to the labor market, etc. You say that the most general issues, problems, needs of the population. But another very important dimension of civil society is the defense of rights and freedoms, as well as the defense of the European vocation and European values in Romania. In recent years, we have seen a very significant responsiveness from on the part of the civil society against the abuses of power and against its illiberal tendencies on the former social democratic government. I mentioned the referendum of shame in 2018, and the contribution of civil society was very important to demobilize people to participate in such referendum against sexual minorities. It was a model of illiberalism copied from Poland or Hungary. But thanks to this responsiveness and the strength of its reaction, very serious, very important decisions for the rule of law and for the Romanian democracy have been prevented, sometimes by violent street fighting. We talk about 10 August 2018, with a huge manifestation in Bucharest and with of diaspora especially, but not only, and with a very strong, very violent, aggressive intervention of military forces against the population. So this is, I can say without hesitation, that the most important actor and the most accurate barometer of Romanian democracy over the last 10 years is civil society. But it's a very important role also during the pandemic. As the government, like all governments in the world, struggled to manage the health crisis, and as the political class was at the same time mobilized for the electoral campaign from December 2020 elections, public interventions and public messages of the state were often hesitant, incoherent, and opportunistic. But in the same time, the needs and problems of different communities were very real and urgent. Of course, medical emergencies, educational needs, access to online educational resources, the supply for people in difficulty during quarantine, the isolation, the effects of isolation on children or on single people or old people, etc. And in these points, precisely, civil society has mobilized in a very exemplary way during the pandemic, with very successful fundraising campaigns, with different forms of solidarity, with interventions, some vital interventions in the society, from small interventions, for example, in poor communities, in cities or villages, with some vital also interventions for the sick people, for example, constructing several ATI sections for the treatment of COVID patients. The state was unable to create rapidly sections to hospitalize people with severe COVID forms, but the civil society created 2 such sections. And the same Romanian civil society has tried to limit the negative effects of the pandemic, quarantine, separation, online school, etc., by massively helping students, by setting up special phone lines dedicated to people in distress, by participating as volunteers in the various government campaigns, or creating conditions for the reception of street children, the persons abused or subject to domestic violence. I have friends which are very involved in these campaigns. Maybe Magic Camp in Bucharest, or the initiatives of Valeriu Nicolae, which works with children from a very poor part of Bucharest, helping them every single day with very small means, trying to help such people. So this is why I will say that indeed civil society in Romania is one of the most important actions. Also, in the same time, in the public action, public interventions, concrete interventions, but also in discourse. You have the NGOs, for example, defending rights of abused people or minorities, sexual minorities, etc. So they are present on different fronts. They are present in different fights in the society, very often against a government which is quite, slow in this action to remain diplomatic. This is slow, and also with a very conservative part of society. The church, the Orthodox Church, for example, is a very reactive and a very conservative part of society, mobilizing people against all kinds of manifestations, all kinds of public intervention. So it's a, infinite fight to defend and to promote rights for people, from abused people, victims of violence, or weak people, people in distress, poor people, or but not just, of course, different minorities, sexual minorities, religious minorities, etc., etc.
It is a fight, and it is a fight that is carried out by a number of organizations and people and civic actors and individuals across the board. But it is not an impossible fight, and it is a fight that it's worth having, as you point out. In Romania, of course, the situation is, I suppose, a bit more complex because of the nature of the Romanian society, and you highlighted some of its characteristics. It's more rural, it's more traditional, conservative. The power of the Orthodox Church is significant, and you have a certain divide between the countryside and the main urban centers. And of course, you also have a divide between access to information. In some of the Romanian villages, of course, the main source of information comes from the TV stations you mentioned, rather than independent media or from outlets which try to fight and combat misinformation and fake news. And that brings me very swiftly, Ciprian, to the next issue, which is connected to media and civil society. Because civil society expresses itself not only through organizations and through activities, but also through a community of people. In our case, as you mentioned, we're talking about journalists who are dedicated to their profession and public mission, journalists who want to promote a rigorously checked set of facts and present a narrative to the population which is not based on subjective, biased, and politically motivated agendas. But at the same time, of course, as you've given us some examples, at the same time, you have a repeated campaign against the civil society and against the journalists by networks, including the TV stations you mentioned, where fake news dominate, where these people are subjected to abuse. And basically, it is a spectacle, both in terms of misinformation, but also spectacle in terms of power, ideology, and televised shows, where public trials and summary judgments take place every evening, almost. So how would you define these media wars, if we can call them like that, in Romania, very briefly? And then in connection to that, if you can add a few words about what is called nowadays cancel culture. A lot of these people would say, well, we can't say what we think because it offends you. And then they engage with disinformation and misinformation and fake news, connecting it to a more broader debate about what's happening in the West in connection to cancel culture.
Maybe you know as well as I do that the Romanian press is going through a very serious crisis. It has its roots in a longer and more general past linked, among others, to competitions from online information. It is an older structural crisis that knows its peculiarities in a Romanian society where a very important part of the media is controlled by very few powerful businessmen, which are very well connected to the political world and to the business world. And some few media groups have captured almost all the written press and, most important, the main television channels, pushing back somehow to the internet, to the online, and to the social networks. Most of the journalists who have not agreed to submit to the political orders of the bosses and forcing them to a very significant professional precariousness. And we can say periodically important and honest journalists declaring their resignations from a job, from a journal, from a TV channel, saying, I have to face now a new challenge of my life. Of course, it's the formal discourse. You don't have the right to say the truth. But I have some friends working in the press saying we were submitted to huge pressures in order to write something or to not write something. So it's a matter of consciousness, finally. This is why media, you call that media wars, much more than wars between a community of honest journalists and the media political and financial network. These media wars are in fact a major conflict between two ways of understanding the role in society of this so-called fourth power. On the one hand, the role of properly informing the public, honestly, especially about the excesses of power, about abuses, and of course, about corruption. It's a kind of counterpower supposed to counterbalance the excesses and the illegalities of power. But on the other hand, you have the role of the power, where the mission of the media is not to inform properly, but rather to manipulate, to distort, to hide, to lynch, to abuse personalities who do not follow the interests behind this pseudo-journalist and pseudo-media. So it's a very strange mediatic landscape in Romania. This is first this concentration of some huge media groups which are controlling the agenda, the public agenda. So if you discuss today about, for example, sexual education, it's because a systematic campaign were launched in a certain moment. And of course, all the society tries now to engage in this debate. It's a kind of noise, actually. This is not a debate. It's how can one create noise in society? On the other hand, what you have see here, the liberal government tried to finance media, tried and did it last year, financing the media in order to promote so-called the vaccination campaign and the information about COVID. And it was a huge amount of money, about, 40 millions of euro dedicated to different TV stations and press, different journals. And in a very ironical way, a lot of televisions uses this money in order to promote anti-COVID, anti-vaccination campaigns. Actually, the government tried to buy the silence and the complaisance, trying to buy the generosity of these channels. But actually, no, media groups are very cynical. They are very aware about their force in society. So they don't have an agenda made by the power. They have their own agenda, and very often the government itself or the society itself has to adapt to this agenda created by media groups. We have about maybe 5 important news channels. From these 5, all 5 were financed by the state, by the government last year. But from these 5, 3, and from time to time, the 4th one, are explicitly against COVID, against the vaccination campaign. So they invite every single day personalities, sometimes very strange personalities. For example, doctors having miraculous solutions to the COVID. There is a woman in a west part of Romania which is healing people from COVID at phone. Now, if you can imagine that. And this person was promoted several weeks by different channels, presenting her miraculous solutions to COVID, for example. It's just to give you an example of these confusions, because it's about confusion. And this confusion is exactly about science and fabulation, about science and non-science, science and mythology. It's a kind of postmodern mythology of healing by miracle. And people believe that no, I don't have to vaccinate because I can find easier solution and non-aggressive solutions. For example, drinking something or talking to the phone with this lady. And you can see the same persons circulating from a channel to the other with this kind of campaign. And among them, in a very sad way, you can see the major figures of the extreme right. This is why, in a very strange way, the anti-vaccination campaign, the anti-COVID campaign is so related with xenophobic, chauvinistic, nationalistic, anti-gay discourse. It's not the same topic, but the actors of these discourses are the same. So they are easily passed from a subject to other. And of course, when you talk about minorities' rights, vaccination is here, is another agenda. When you talk about hospitals, you have a problem with minorities, etc. This kind of confusions, actually, which is very aggressive and at the same time doesn't allow people to see the priorities, an order of priorities. What is the most important for us? For example, this media cultivated every day this discourse about freedom. Personalities from extreme right or this kind of personalities I have talked about are fighting for our freedom and dignity. And the freedom is the freedom to not wear a mask, for example. This is a kind of freedom. The freedom is not to be vaccinated. Of course, we can accept this. It's not a problem. The entire campaign was about individuals, about persons, not about solidarity. The word solidarity is not present in these discourses. And the whole campaign was deformed, putting the accent on the, yes, we are fighting now for our rights and for our freedoms. But it's not about freedom now. Of course, it's about freedom. We can discuss about freedom. We can discuss about rights. These persons were not there when the former government, for example, attacked very violently the basic rights, the constitutional rights. But they are now talking about rights and freedoms in relation with the pandemic. And it's not about community, it's not about responsiveness, it's not about responsibility or solidarity with weak people, vulnerable people. No, it's about my liberty, it's about my right to move freely in society. No, it's a kind of manipulated agenda, and it's very difficult because it's about technical means. We are discussing, I'm writing every day on Facebook or another social networks, but I don't have the same impact as a person talking to the TV in front of millions of people.
Well, I suppose this is where the whole thing of the so-called cancel culture comes in, as these people would pretend, of course, they are upholding democratic values. They are upholding, as you say, individual rights, whilst at the same time what they are doing, in effect, is basically a campaign of misinformation, promoting fake news, and basically pseudoscientific narratives they put forward. And one of the reasons, perhaps, why they are so successful in Romania is that there is a lack of scientific knowledge amongst the population. People don't really know much about modern medicine or modern science, and education is essential. And I hope we'll have time in future conversations to return to some of these issues, Ciprian. But now we need to close this, and I would like to raise this issue before we finalize this discussion, to raise this issue about what can we do? How can we fight back? It is very important, as you pointed out, to highlight, notify, expose fake news, expose pseudoscientific narratives, engage with misinformation, disinformation, and so on. But how can we, as an academic or scientific or a cultural community or as simple citizens, fight back?
I'll try to be very brief. And I think the major point here is courage. The academic community should have the courage to expose publicly ideas. We have this tradition, of course, of being very active in our academic communities. We have a strong academic communities with several universities, major universities in Romania, with people, with public intellectuals. But the courage of public discourse is not present there. And what we have to do is to create the link between science and public, a kind of good vulgarization, good popularization of science. Strong sciences, physics, chemistry, of course, medicine, etc., but also human sciences, social and human sciences, in order to explain to people significations of different events, of different situations, of global situations. We are living today in a linked culture, in linked global culture, and all that happens in a part of the world is present also impacting us in the same time. And I'm fighting for this. We did it several times in different public interventions to touch people who don't have the practice of dialogue with the science, and having a good discourse about science, trying not to present it as something very complicated, something very sophisticated, elites for some few people, but in a way that is more and more present in Western cultures, in France, in UK, in the United States, having a very popular approach of science. And we are able to do this. It's not easy to do it, because it's one thing to speak in front of students, something very technical, but it's much more difficult to present the same thing in front of simple people. And you have to adapt your discourse, to make efforts, to change the method, to have a kind of humility of public discourse, because it's not easy to keep this kind of discourse. You are often very attacked. People are asking stupid questions, so-called stupid questions. You have to adapt it. But we have this duty, we have this responsibility in the society to create a discourse of truth, a discourse of knowledge, to promote for the children, for the people, the passion of knowledge and on science. Otherwise, you have alternative solutions which are very dangerous for the future of this society.
A passion for knowledge and for science, Ciprian. I would like to end our conversation with this call and optimistic, in a way, view, although it is based on a rather pessimistic evaluation of the situation in Romania at the moment, but we're always looking towards the future. And as you rightly pointed out, there is need for renewed engagement with civil society. There is need for scientists to go out there and explain to the population what's happening. And we need to go out of the ivory towers of universities and research institutes and engage with the public. I'm very grateful to you, Ciprian, for this enlightening conversation and for sharing with us and with our listeners and viewers your insights into what's happening in Romania at the moment. And we're very much looking forward to having you again in our future conversations, and hopefully with some better news about the strength of civil society and the success of journalists and academics and intellectuals in the fight against misinformation and disinformation and pseudoscience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I'm honored and I'm very pleased to be here. And you can count on me for further presence in the dialogues. It will be always a great moment for me.